Have you ever wondered if there are truths about death so powerful, so unsettling, that they were deliberately kept from you? Imagine this Carl Jung, the man who helped shape modern psychology, the mind explorer who dared to map the human soul, kept a journal. But not just any journal. This one was hidden away, locked in time for decades. And according to whispers from those who have seen it, its contents were never meant for the public eye. We're not talking about dusty academic theories or dry philosophical musings. No. These pages are alive. They carry the weight of a man who had walked to the very edge of life, peered into the unknown, and returned with visions so vivid they shook him to his core. In these writings, you won't find textbook definitions. You'll find confessions raw and unfiltered. You'll find visions strange, luminous, otherworldly. And you'll find warnings, the kind that make you stop breathing for just a moment, because they sound like they were meant for you. But here's what makes this story even more haunting. Jung himself feared we weren't ready to hear them. He believed the world distracted, divided, and obsessed with the surface would either laugh at what he had seen or twist it into something meaningless. So the journal was hidden, protected, buried, not lost, but waiting. Waiting for a time when maybe, just maybe, humanity could look beyond the veil without turning away. And that time might be now. Because today we're going to open that journal. We're going to walk with Jung into the strange and symbolic landscapes he saw on the other side of death. We're going to hear the truths he believed could change the way we live and the way we face our final moments. So, if you've ever felt that quiet pull, that question in the back of your mind, what really happens when it's all over? Stay with me. What you're about to hear won't just challenge what you think you know about death. It might change the way you see life itself. It was the winter of 1944, and Carl Jung, already a towering figure in the world of psychology, was 68 years old. He had spent decades mapping the hidden landscapes of the human mind. Yet nothing could have prepared him for what was about to happen. One evening, Jung suffered a massive heart attack. His body collapsed, and for the weeks he drifted between life and death. Doctors at the time could do little beyond keeping him in bed and hoping for recovery. But Jung later revealed something far stranger, that during this time, while his body lay weak and pale in the hospital, his mind, or perhaps his soul, was somewhere else entirely. He claimed to have floated above the earth as if gravity itself had released him. He could see our planet below, fragile, small, turning slowly in the darkness of space. And then, in the distance, he saw it, a massive temple of light. It wasn't a structure made of stone or brick. It shimmered almost alive, radiating a warmth that seemed to call him forward. As he moved closer, he saw figures, ancient, ageless beings, waiting at its entrance. They were not like the people we see in daily life. They felt timeless, as if they had been there long before humanity existed. Jung described them not as dreamlike illusions, but as more real than waking life. The pull toward that temple was overwhelming. It wasn't just beauty, it was a sense of truth, of home. And yet, just as he neared its gates, something or someone stopped him. He was told it was not his time. And with that, he was pulled back into the cold, heavy weight of his own body, back into the hospital bed, back into the world of the living. When Jung finally recovered enough to speak and write again, he didn't rush to tell the world. In fact, he did the opposite. He began to write privately, filling page after page with the details of what he had seen. But these were not for his lectures, not for his students, and certainly not for the public. These were deeply personal records. He later referred to them as my confrontation with the infinite. This was not theory, it was testimony. It was the raw, unfiltered truth of what he had experienced beyond the threshold of life. And here's where the story takes an even more intriguing turn. These pages remained hidden, not for months, not for a few years, but for decades. They were never lost. They were simply kept away. Why? Not because they lacked importance, but because in Jung's mind, they were too important. He feared what would happen if the wrong eyes saw them. If these visions, layered with symbolism and archetypes, fell into the hands of people who weren't ready, they might be misunderstood, stripped of their depth, or worse, twisted into dogma. Jung was deeply aware of how humanity tends to handle sacred knowledge. We either worship it blindly, turning it into rigid belief systems, or we dismiss it entirely as fantasy. Neither he believed would serve the truth he had encountered. So he waited. And this is something we have to understand about Jung. He didn't just see himself as a scientist of the mind. He saw himself as a kind of guide leading people through the inner landscapes of the psyche. He knew the dangers of giving someone a map to a place they weren't prepared to visit. Without the right preparation, the journey could overwhelm, distort, or even destroy. Think about it. How many times in your own life have you been given a truth you weren't ready to hear? Something that, in hindsight, you could understand. But at the time, it only confused or frightened you. That's what Jung feared for the world. That's why his most personal account of the afterlife, of crossing that invisible boundary, was kept from public eyes. And yet, by locking it away, he also created a mystery. A whispered question that has grown louder with each passing decade. What did Jung see that made him believe humanity wasn't ready? These pages were never meant to become casual reading. They were written for those who were ready to wrestle with the deepest questions a human being can face. Questions about life, death, and what happens when we step beyond the limits of time and flesh. It's important to remember Jung wasn't a man prone to exaggeration. He built his reputation on careful observation, on years of studying dreams, myths, and the shared patterns of the human mind. And yet, here he was writing about visions that defied the boundaries of science. He didn't call them hallucinations. He didn't dismiss them as the product of a dying brain. No, he believed they were encounters with archetypal truths, the same kind of truths that show up in the myths of ancient cultures and the dreams of ordinary people. But he also believed they demanded respect, the kind of respect you give a force that can either illuminate you or burn you. And so the journal stayed hidden, until whispers began to surface, until small fragments began to find their way into conversations, biographies, and the curiosity of those who sensed there was more to Jung's story than we had been told. And now, all these years later, we find ourselves looking at those pages. We find ourselves tracing the words of a man who had been to the threshold and chose not to step through. The question is, why? And perhaps more importantly, what would you have done if you were in his place? When Jung's pen touched the paper, he didn't just record what he saw. He carved a doorway into a reality few have ever glimpsed. One of the most vivid entries in his secret journal describes a structure, but not one built by human hands. He called it a luminous temple suspended in the infinite blackness of space. It was vast, yet weightless. It shimmered not with light from the sun, but with a glow that seemed to come from within, as if the very walls were alive. This was no ordinary building. In fact, Jung insisted it wasn't a building at all. It was a living symbol, a manifestation of something far greater, what he called the self. And the self in Jung's psychology isn't just who you think you are. It's the eternal essence, the part of you untouched by time, untouched by death. It is beyond ego, beyond your name, beyond the roles you've played in life. As he moved toward this temple, he realized he was not alone. Inside, figures were waiting. They were unlike any humans he had ever known, not gods in the religious sense, but archetypal beings. They radiated a presence that was both comforting and intimidating. Some seemed to welcome him, guiding him forward. Others seemed to challenge him, as if testing whether he was ready to enter. Jung felt their gaze cut through him, past his accomplishments, past his theories, past even his sense of self. And then came the realization that shook him to the core. There was no God here in the conventional sense. No bearded man in the clouds, no throne. Instead, there was an overwhelming presence of truth itself, a force so pure that it stripped away every mask he had worn in life. He wrote, "Here there is no pretending. You face only what is truly you." Imagine that for a moment. Every story you've told yourself about who you are gone. Every excuse, every justification, every shield you've built to protect your image. Gone. Standing in the presence of this force, there's no room for performance. You are simply and terrifyingly yourself. What makes this even more chilling is that Jung didn't believe this experience was unique to him. He claimed that many souls, upon approaching death, encounter similar archetypal symbols, not as random hallucinations from a failing brain, but as universal psychic truths, temples of light, guides who lead you onward, rivers you must cross, mountains you must climb. These images appear across cultures and centuries, in the myths of ancient civilizations, in the dreams of people who've never met, and in the near-death accounts of those revived on hospital beds. Jung believed these recurring images were not coincidence. They were the language of the soul, a shared map written deep in the collective unconscious, a kind of universal blueprint for the journey beyond life. Think about it. Why do cultures separated by oceans and millennia share eerily similar depictions of the afterlife? Why do people who've never read the same books or prayed to the same gods see the same rivers, the same gates, the same figures in their final moments? To Jung, this wasn't just fascinating. It was confirmation. The afterlife, he suggested, may not be a random chaos or a purely religious invention, but a deeply structured psychological reality, one that our minds, or perhaps our souls, have always known how to navigate. And yet, these visions weren't all comforting. Some of the archetypes he encountered in that temple did not smile or offer a hand. They stood in his path, challenging him, reflecting back the parts of himself he had avoided or ignored. That's the thing about truth, but it doesn't just affirm what you want to believe. It also confronts you with what you've tried to forget. Jung's description of the temple reads almost like an initiation, a final test before crossing fully into whatever lies beyond. You don't enter simply because you want to. You enter because you faced yourself without flinching. And here's where his insight becomes personal for all of us. If what Jung saw is true, then one day you and I will face our own temple. We'll meet our own archetypal guides and perhaps our own challengers. And in that moment, there will be no pretending, no resume, no carefully curated image, just the essence of who we really are. That's a sobering thought, but also a strangely liberating one. Because if we know that day is coming, we can prepare for it now. We can begin stripping away the false layers we've built long before they're forcibly removed. It's worth asking yourself, if you were to stand in that temple today, what would remain? Would you be able to walk through its gates without hesitation? Or would you find yourself held back, not by anyone else, but by the weight of your own unacknowledged truths. Jung never claimed to have all the answers. But in his secret journal, he left us an image, a luminous temple suspended in the cosmos, and a challenge to meet ourselves honestly before time forces us to. And maybe that's why these visions matter. Not because they tell us exactly what happens after death, but because they show us what's possible before it. Up until now, Jung's secret journal reads like a journey through light, luminous temples guiding figures' truths stripped bare. But then, the tone changes. The pages grow heavier. The visions take on a sharper edge. Jung begins to write about what he calls spiritual traps, hidden snares, waiting for the soul after death. And according to him, these traps are not the work of some outside force. They are created by us. They are the echoes of who we were in life and what we refuse to let go of. The first he warns is the ego trap. This is when a soul clings desperately to its identity, to the name, the face, the roles it played in life. Maybe it's the pride of achievements. Maybe it's the bitterness of unfinished business. Maybe it's the inability to forgive. In this trap, the soul keeps saying, I am this person. I am this story. I cannot let it go. But in the afterlife, Jung suggests you cannot cross into what's next if you're still gripping what's already gone. Imagine trying to walk through a doorway while carrying everything you've ever owned you can't fit. Something has to be released. Then comes the second and perhaps more frightening snare, the shadow trap. For Jung, the shadow is not evil in the cartoonish sense. It is the collection of everything about yourself you've pushed away. The shame, the rage, the selfishness, the fear. It's the truth you've refused to admit. And in his vision, there is no avoiding it. At the threshold between worlds, the shadow stands before you like a mirror you cannot turn away from. You see everything, not just the good you did, but the harm you caused, the love you withheld. At the moments you betrayed your own values. Jung makes it clear, if you cannot face your shadow, you cannot move on. Now let's pause for a second. This is not the kind of afterlife most of us grew up hearing about. There's no instant paradise here. No automatic entry just because your heart stopped beating. To Jung, the afterlife is not a reward handed to you. It is a process, a psychological and spiritual initiation. He calls it a final individuation. That means your soul's last and greatest task is to integrate everything it has been, the light and the dark, the noble and the shameful, into a whole. It's not about erasing the past. It's about owning it, accepting it, becoming complete. Think about that for a moment. How many of us spend our lives running from ourselves, distracting, avoiding, pretending? If Jung is right, all those things we think we've buried, we will meet again. Not as punishment, not as condemnation, but as the final work of the soul. Some people might hear this and feel fear. But there's another way to hear it, as a warning, yes, but also as an opportunity. Because if these traps exist, the time to face them is not after we die. It's now. If the ego trap is clinging to who we think we are, maybe the work is learning to loosen that grip while we're still here, to remember that our worth is not just in our title, our possessions, or our reputation. If the shadow trap is avoiding our inner darkness, maybe the work is turning toward it now. Learning to acknowledge our flaws, make amends, and integrate those parts of ourselves into something whole. This, I think, is the real gift of Jung's warning. It's not meant to scare us into obedience. It's meant to prepare us for freedom. Because in his vision, crossing the threshold is not about being good enough by someone else's standard. It's about being whole enough by your own. But here's the hard truth. Wholeness is not comfortable. It means standing in the full light of your own being, no filters, no performance, and saying, yes, this is me. Imagine that moment. Imagine you are standing at the gates of that luminous temple, as Jung described earlier. Imagine you've passed through the dark void of space to stand before the presence of truth. And then imagine that before you can step inside, you must answer the unspoken question. Have you faced yourself, not just the parts you like? All of it. If you can say yes, perhaps the gates open. If you can't, maybe you remain in the outer court, circling, struggling until you're ready to answer. That is the picture Jung leaves us with. And whether you take it literally, metaphorically, or somewhere in between, it asks something of you. It asks you to stop running, to stop pretending, to stop waiting for someday to do the work your soul came here to do. Because if Jung is right, death is not the great escape we imagine. It is the great unveiling. And when that veil lifts, the only thing standing between you and what's next is you. So why would Carl Jung, a man who devoted his life to exploring the deepest corners of the human psyche, keep something this monumental a secret? He wasn't trying to hoard power. He wasn't trying to create some exclusive spiritual club. The reason was far simpler and far more sobering. Jung understood the world he lived in. And in many ways, it's the same world we live in now, obsessed with material success status and shallow distractions. A world where most people are far more interested in building their bank accounts than building their souls. He knew that if these visions were released to the public, they would be mishandled. At best, they'd be sensationalized, turned into mystical clickbait, stripped of their depth, reduced to a cheap headline, "Famous psychologist sees heaven." At worst, they'd be dismissed entirely, chalked up to brain chemistry hallucinations or the fantasies of a man on his deathbed. Either way, the real lesson would be lost. Jung's work was never about giving people quick answers. It was about guiding them into the work of self-discovery. And here's the thing, the kind of work is uncomfortable. It's not flashy. It doesn't go viral. It requires stillness, reflection, honesty, things that don't fit neatly into the fast, noisy way the world operates. And perhaps on a deeper level, Jung also knew something that every true seeker eventually learns. Part of the journey is finding the truth yourself, because hearing it from someone else is never the same as living it. Think about the most profound lessons you've learned in your own life. Did they come from a lecture, a quote on social media? Or did they come from an experience, something you had to feel, to wrestle with, to earn? Jung understood that if he handed people the truth about the afterlife before they were ready, it would be like giving a map to a traveler who has no idea where they are. The map would mean nothing. Or worse, it would mislead them entirely. So he chose to protect it, to let time decide when and to whom these pages would speak. Maybe he hoped that one day the world would slow down enough to listen. Or maybe he knew the world never would, and that these words would only reach those who were already searching, those who could feel deep in their bones that life is more than the surface we see. And that brings us to a question only you can answer. If you had been in Jung's place, would you have shared everything? Or would you have guarded it, waiting for the right moment? Because maybe the real power of his decision isn't just in what he wrote, but in what he left unsaid, forcing us to take the first steps toward that truth ourselves. Here's the thing. The world Carl Jung feared, it's not some distant possibility. It's the one we live in right now. Distracted, divided, spiritually starved. We're surrounded by noise, constant notifications, endless opinions, and an ever-spinning cycle of urgency that leaves no room for stillness. We're more connected than ever, but more disconnected from ourselves than at any point in history. And yet, paradoxically, we are also more curious than ever about what lies beyond death. Everywhere you look, people are asking the big questions again. Near-death experience accounts are watched by millions. Stories of reincarnation make headlines. Quantum theories about consciousness challenge the old boundaries of science. Even in the middle of our chaos, something inside us is whispering, "There's more." Maybe that's why Jung's hidden journal feels so urgent now. Because it wasn't written for an audience chasing distractions. It was written for those willing to stop to listen and to face themselves honestly. And maybe, just maybe, this is the moment he was waiting for. Think about it. For decades, his most intimate visions and warnings were kept away, almost as if they were seeds buried deep underground. Now, in a time when the world feels like it's shifting beneath our feet, those seeds are breaking through the surface. And his message, it's simple, but it's also terrifying. If you want peace after death, you must make peace within yourself now. Not tomorrow. Not someday when life calms down. Now. Because the work of the soul doesn't start at the moment your heart stops beating. It's happening right here in every choice you make, every truth you avoid, every hurt you heal or ignore. Jung's vision of the afterlife wasn't about reward or punishment. It was about readiness. He believed the state of your soul at death is simply the truth of how you've lived, magnified and unmasked. If you die carrying resentment, fear, or denial, those are the first things you'll meet on the other side. That's why his journal matters today. Not because it gives us a perfect map of what's coming, but because it hands us a mirror for where we are now. So ask yourself, if that final moment came tonight, what part of you would still be unsettled? What truth have you been putting off? What forgiveness have you withheld from others or from yourself? These aren't easy questions. But maybe that's the point. Because in Jung's eyes, the most important preparation for death is learning how to live without hiding from yourself. And in a world as fast, fractured, and restless as ours, that might be the most radical thing you can do. So, what will you face in your own temple? Will you step through its gates, freely light in spirit, ready to embrace whatever waits beyond? Or will you find yourself standing at the threshold, weighed down by what you couldn't release, trapped not by any outside force, but by the grip of your own unfinished business? Carl Jung's secret journal isn't just a story about the afterlife. It's a mirror held up to this life, to the choices you make, the truths you face, and the shadows you avoid. It's about the work your soul must do now, before it's too late. Because if Jung is right, death doesn't suddenly make you wiser, purer, or more at peace. It simply reveals who you already are. And that's why every conversation you avoid, every wound you ignore, every part of yourself you refuse to look at, those things matter. They don't disappear. They wait. If this was your last day, what part of your soul would you want to face without fear? That's not a rhetorical question. It's an invitation. And I'd like you to take a moment right now to think about it. Write it down. Share it in the comments. I want to hear your truth, because speaking it aloud might be the first step toward freeing yourself from it. And remember, this journey we've been on today, it's only the beginning. If you want to explore more of Jung's hidden wisdom and the visions he never dared publish, the truths he feared the world wasn't ready for, then make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Because in the next video, we're going deeper into the most mysterious pages of his secret journal. Until then, may you find the courage to face yourself so that when your temple appears, you walk through its gates without looking back.